Hello, everybody. Just getting set up here. And this could be challenging because it is not letting me screen share. Oh, here we go. Hello, everybody. We'll be starting here in like 3 minutes. Just waiting for some people to join the room. Okay, hello. Awesome. Well, we'll be starting here in about a minute. I'm not sure if there's anybody in the room, but I'm excited to get the conversation started. I am sure at some point during the conversation you're going to hear my dogs. I am working remote from my house, and they are a little bit loud sometimes, but we'll try to keep them under control. Hey, Larry. How's it going? Excellent. Excellent. I'll try to keep the conversation here pretty cut and dry and short and to the point. Obviously, if this was a in-person presentation, we would be doing some questions throughout the presentation, a little bit of engagement, and a lot of that aspect has been cut out of the presentation. So I will get through this, and at the end we can open it up for some questions. And I'm going to start the screen share now that we've hit 150. Okay, awesome. Well, I'll start out by introducing myself. My name is Brandon Barr. I'm the president at Simple Solvents, and we focus on alleviating stresses in the solvent supply chain. I will get more into our company at the end of the presentation. I want to kind of get into the nitty-gritty here. And we're going to be talking about supply chain troubles and tips. And a lot of this is going to be relevant due to what we've experienced throughout COVID, but it is very relevant for the normal world as well once we get back to normality here. So I'm going to start at the outline. So what we're going to be talking about today, we've got a couple important questions, and through that we're going to dive into the business of chemical supply, evaluating some risks of not having a properly set up supply chain. We're going to go over some common obstacles, world events, and freight and logistics. We'll be touching on freight and logistics. I mean, almost at every point in the conversation, it's one of the most important aspects of your chemical supply chain. And it has been, obviously since COVID, one of the harder things to manage. Diving into the important questions. So, when you're extracting and when you're using solvents, there are a lot of things to consider. So number one, looking at your volume, looking at your staff, looking at your recovery rates. There's a lot of questions that don't seem so obvious that you need to ask yourself. And these are kind of the most common things, and I'm going to dive into each one of them. So diving into what are your solvent usage projections? What that's going to do is, you're going to take into account, obviously, the biomass. You're going to take into account the potency, your recovery rates. You're going to be taking into account your staff, your capacity of your equipment. There's a lot of different factors that lead into how much of each particular solvent you're going to be looking at. And when you're starting out, a lot of these things aren't super clear, and once you get up and running, they become more clear, and obviously efficiencies get better over time. So some of the things, especially if you're new and you're not up and running, some of the things that you want to look at and ask your equipment providers are, what is the throughput? What chemicals should I be using? And based on the amount of material and throughput that's going to go through the machine, what is how much solvents will I actually need, whether that's ethanol, heptane, pentane, hexane, etc. And diving into the recovery rate, that's going to be it's variable. It's going to change based on your equipment, based on your expertise. And, if you have a savvy team, as you go, your recovery rate is going to increase. And depending on what you're doing, whether that's a biomass extraction to crude or bringing that all the way to isolate, you're going to be looking at different chemicals, and each set of equipment is going to have a different recovery rate, and they're all going to have different throughputs. So the big thing there is, it is a big question mark before you get up and running. There are efficiencies that you'll iron out over, the first couple months of production. And, it's something that that's one of the big metrics that as an extractor, you need to be looking at improving. And there's going to be a point in diminishing returns where your recovery rate is capped out, but it is a little bit of a journey to get to that point. Diving into the next question, do you account for varying costs? And what I mean by this is in your chemical supply chain, a lot of the industry utilizes ethanol that is corn-based ethanol. And if you look at the corn market, there are fluctuations in price throughout the year. Now, obviously there's a harvest. There are, purchasing of corn going on all year long. But what happens is there are waves of price increases and reductions based on supply and demand. Corn is a commodity, and corn is the number one thing that you are using to create ethanol. The interesting thing is we look at business plans. We help consult on business plans and see, before facilities are up and running, are you accounting for varying costs? Are you looking at the market and understanding that if you are purchasing, and this is diving in a little bit to the next question, but if you're diving into spot orders and you're only ordering when you need it, you're going to get hit by those varying costs, to a lot higher degree than if you were on a contractual purchasing schedule. The difficult part about the contractual purchasing schedules are you have to have your projections down. You have to have your recovery rates down. There's a level of experience and a level of math that goes into even having the ability to get onto a contractual agreement. But what happens is if you are on a contractual agreement, it will help you mitigate the rise and fall of the commodities that you're using. And for a lot of the smaller guys, it's going to be really hard to do that. And in the beginning, like I said, it's going to be really hard to operate on a contractual basis. And, diving into spot orders, and what I mean by a spot order is if you need product, if you need ethanol, if you need heptane, pentane, hexane tomorrow, and you didn't account for that, and you didn't order ahead of time, basically a non-contractual spot order, something that falls outside of a contract. What's going to happen is you're going to pay too much for the product. You're going to pay too much for the freight. And what's going to happen is your lead time is going to be substantially longer. So without predictability, what happens is you place an order and you say, hey, I need, a tote of ethanol by Friday. Well, chances are, depending on where you're located, there are regional distributors. But if you're pulling directly from the manufacturers, there are lead times to that. And it's not necessarily a lead time to get your product put together, but you have to get that product onto a truck and you have to move that product. Now, depending on the volume, you're going to be going through LTL, which is a partial shipment, for pallets and totes. And the problem about the partial shipments are you run into a scenario that you don't get to control how fast the product will arrive. And that's problematic because sometimes with LTL, it could get picked up today and it might show up in 3 days. But on the other hand, it might show up in 15, 16 days. And COVID specifically has increased, the time it takes for LTL shipments to arrive because there's a shortage of drivers. Logistics in general are just really, really chaotic right now. So not only are you seeing increased costs for LTL shipment, but you're also seeing increased lead times. So without, wrapping this all back together for varying costs, your costs are going to vary based on the time of year. They're going to vary, especially if you're not in a contract, and they're going to vary on a landed basis, right? Bring the product right to your door, because freight is fluctuating like crazy. Now, to control freight costs from going absolutely outrageous, having a lead time and understanding, hey, if I order something tomorrow and I need it there by Monday, you're going to be paying a whole lot more than if you book that load 7, 10, 15 days in advance. So all of these things, come into play when you're sourcing chemicals, because you're not just looking at the cost per gallon, you're looking at the landed cost per gallon. And what comes along with that is time. How long is it going to take for that product to get to you? Diving into the next really important question is, how do you account for inventory and time management? Because managing inventory is very tough. And I'll dive into this in a little bit with, kind of common obstacles, and I'll touch on it now. But basically, when you're storing hydrocarbons, you're working in conjunction with your fire marshal. And depending on how your building and facility is set up, you're going to have limits on how much you can even have there at any given time. So that makes it really tough to account for inventory, because depending on your building and depending on your county, your limits might be lower than what you need. And they might be high enough so you can have product on site to run. But what happens is, if you can't store enough on site to hold you over until your next order gets there, your order cadence is going to be extremely high. I mean, you're going to have to order multiple times versus ordering for 1 or 2 months in one swing and storing it. Now, what that means is, especially if you're ordering less than a full truckload of chemicals, ordering each time, you're going to have a substantial freight bill that really impacts the landed cost per gallon or cost per pound on your solvents. And at the end of the day, the higher cost of solvents and the higher cost of ethanol and everything you're using for extraction is going to impact the end price of your distillates, your crude oil, your isolates. So looking at how to manage inventory is tough, because you have to have some collaboration with your fire marshal. And there often is a level of building improvement that you're going to have to go through to make sure that you can store enough of these hydrocarbons on site and still be safe and in compliance with your fire marshal. So that's something that's tough, because the smaller scale you are, the less flexibility that you have for holding this stuff on site, which means your order cadence is going to be super high. And there's a lot of variables that come into, how much is it going to cost and how fast is it going to get to you, right? So, looking on the other end of that, so time management, looking at the factors of how much manpower does it take to run all of this equipment. And the big question is, what happens if my ethanol shipment is late? It got caught in LTL and it's going to be 3 days late. Well, the problem with that, without proper inventory management and time management, you're at risk of having a facility full of workers with no chemicals to do your actual job. And that puts a lot of stress on the business, because now the ownership team has to make a decision. Do we send these guys home? Do we keep them on? It's tough. Obviously, when you don't have product, your facility is not efficient. You're not running. So these are all things that you have to account for when you're sourcing your solvents, because any little hiccup could cause your production line to be idle. But that is an opportunity cost. That has a substantial cost on your business, because you're not running. You've got employees. Now you're late on orders. And all of this stuff is not necessarily always avoidable, because, like I said, the fire marshal really, really makes it tough to hold enough product on site. But the big goal is to order for 1 and ideally 2 months at a time and have the ability to store all of that on site. So when you have the conversations with your fire marshal in your local jurisdiction, you need to understand what are your solvent usage projections. How much are you going to use in a 30-day, 60-day period? And what is the recovery rate? All of these things are going to come into play when you have that conversation with your fire marshal, because you need to know how much you need to have on site to operate for 30 or 60 days at a time. And if you're not educated coming into the conversation with the fire marshal, you might end up being in a corner and not even having the ability to store enough hydrocarbons on site to have a successful operation. So these are all very important things. I'm going to dive into the business of chemical supply now. And this is kind of just an overall summary about how these chemicals move. It is pretty complex, and we are in a globalized world. A lot of these chemicals are not made everywhere, and that poses challenges. So, for example, if you look at ethanol is produced from corn. Well, corn is not produced all over the world. And even within the United States, it's only growing within the Corn Belt, right? So what happens is there's a lot of chemical trading happening. There's a lot of import and export happening. Many hydrocarbons are produced within the United States. Obviously, there's a high level of ethanol. There is isopropyl, heptane, pentane, hexane, butane. Some of your gas solvents as well are produced here. But the problem with it is the scale is not very large. And the United States economy, these chemicals are used in multiple industries. And some of those industries are favored more than cannabis and hemp. And when things get tight on supply, the allocation gets locked up. And oftentimes we find that the hemp and cannabis industries are the ones that are overlooked, because the pharmaceutical industry, health and wellness, and some of these things that are kind of dictated by the government get that supply first. So what happens is you get into regional distribution, where a normal purchaser or consumer of hydrocarbons does not have the ability to purchase direct from a manufacturer. The manufacturers often do not sell direct. And what that means is they've got a team of distribution companies that purchase and warehouse their product on their behalf in order to increase efficiencies. So, with regional distribution, it's extremely important because, like I was saying earlier, the corn is produced in the Midwest. Well, getting ethanol out to California, for example, is expensive. And if you're pulling a tote or a pallet of drums, from the Midwest all the way out to California, there's going to be a very, very substantial freight charge associated with that. So regional distribution is extremely important because you're moving, the manufacturers will sell to a distributor, and the distributors will bring it to their region in bulk, in very large bulk, and they'll break it down into totes, drums, sometimes 5-gallon and 1-gallon units. And without regional distribution, the world of solvent supply it's not round. And what you find is, especially with imported chemicals, there's a big lapse because, and this is a result of COVID, because when the domestic supply dried up of certain chemicals, and I'll dive into that here later, when certain chemical production dried up, the United States market had to go and pivot over to import. So, what comes along with the import is, well, that's going to either land in California, Houston, New Jersey. Those are the more popular ports. But how are you going to get that product to the people in the Midwest from the ports? Or how are you going to get, the product from New Jersey, if it lands at the New Jersey port, all the way out to, say, Nevada, right? It all relies on regional distribution. So the importers and the manufacturers generally do not sell directly to the end user, the extractors in our case. So it's an interesting market because there's a lot of ethanol export. You know, we're very, very large exporter in ethanol, and it goes all over the world. But right now, because of COVID, our hydrocarbon supply has been so choked that things like heptane, pentane, and hexane are often imported, and isopropyl alcohol as well is definitely one of the higher imported solvents. So, you know, diving into the next point, volume talks, and it kind of comes back to the same standpoint. You know, the manufacturers do not sell to the end users. So if they do, and allocation gets tight, the smaller buyers are the ones that, you know, they're the ones that get kicked to the curb. The volume buyers and the ones that are on multi-year commitments to the massive manufacturers like Exxon and Chevron Phillips, you know, those are the people and those are the companies that will get served first, and the small guys get overlooked. So it's just an interesting dynamic because, you know, in the hemp world and the cannabis world, there are some users that are large enough to potentially buy directly from manufacturers. But when things get tight, you become one of the smaller buyers, and they might pinch off your supply in total. So having a relationship with the distributors is absolutely crucial. You know, what this all comes down to is making sure your supply chain is multifaceted. It's got options, because if you are buying direct and now their allocation is tight, now you don't have product and you're going to have to go do all the legwork to find the distributors. So I recommend, you know, if you're up and running, having multiple points of supply is huge. In the same token, finding suppliers that don't make you hunt product, right? So for example, understanding what hydrocarbons and solvents you're using and finding suppliers and manufacturers that work with most or all of your needs is important, because at the end of the day, sourcing chemicals is very time intensive, and working with a group that has all of the products that you're going to need is crucial, because the time spent on sourcing and ordering substantially goes down. Now, you always want to have a backup, but those backups can have the same mentality. You know, look for companies that are a one-stop shop for the hydrocarbons and solvents that you're utilizing, but also make sure you've got a backup. It's super crucial. Now, the other thing, again, and you know, we're going to talk about freight and logistics over and over and over. It's huge. I mean, this product has to move all around the world, and it's chaotic right now with imports. It's chaotic with exports. Ports are extremely clogged. I mean, you know, last week I was reading an article about how there are 44 vessels sitting outside the port of LA right now, and each vessel just, you know, has a massive amount of product on it, and it's stuck. You know, the port is clogged, and so how do you get that? How do you alleviate that? Well, you have to account for it, you know, and once it gets through the port, well, you've got to move that product, you know, to regional distributors with warehouses. And even if it's a domestically produced product, that product still has to move from the plant to distributors, from the plant directly to the buyer, or from a distributor directly to a buyer. And, you know, kind of diving into those headaches, you know, I was mentioning earlier with LTL, the smaller shipments, it's chaos. I mean, you don't know when the product is going to get to you because of how the market is right now. And sometimes if you're in a bind, you have to buy a dedicated truck to make sure your timeline is guaranteed, because the LTL trucks, you know, they piece together multiple orders that are going in the same regions and put them all in the same truck. And there's a lot of logistics and headaches that go into not having your own dedicated truck. So LTL is a mess. Even just normal trucks are increasing in demand. I mean, the drivers there's less drivers on the road. Product needs to move around, and the drivers and the freight companies are in a scenario where they need to pick and choose who they work with, obviously based on ease and relationships, but also based on how much money they're making. So all of this comes down to having solid relationships in the freight and logistics world and having solid relationships in the chemical manufacturing and distribution world. You need to look at each one of these different pieces because they all come together. And one hiccup could put your facility out of work for a week, 2 weeks, a month, especially right now with imports taking, 3-4 months to get into the United States and through the port. So the whole supply chain is clogged, and some of this stuff is unavoidable. Some of it's unavoidable, but with proper planning and proper time and inventory management, you can at least alleviate some of these problems from popping up. So risks, and I've kind of talked on this throughout the conversation here, but risks of a poor supply chain. I mean, number one, production delays are huge. You'll have idle staff that you may or may not be paying. Your customers are going to be angry. There is a substantial amount of time on your team that has to be invested in mitigating damages. So you're talking to your clients, you're talking to your suppliers, and you're spending a whole lot of resources to just make sure this stuff is happening and getting to where it needs to go. High prices and poor customer support are probably one of the bigger issues now, because what you see is, number one, suppliers, their pricing is all over the board. I find people paying way too much in too many scenarios, but I think the bigger dagger is poor customer support, because, what happens if you say you order a pallet of N-heptane drums and there is a delay in the truck getting to the facility. With poor customer support, what's going to happen is you're going to find yourself calling your suppliers and hunting them down to get answers, which again is a resource. That costs money to spend the time to hunt down your product. When you have a supplier that is over communicative, what you're going to find is, there's problems, and there's problems that nobody can solve or avoid. But the interesting thing is, when you work with a supplier who is fully transparent, all of these things are communicated immediately. So if there's a delay, there's a delay, and now you can game plan, and you're not sitting there waiting for 3 days in limbo, not knowing if there is a delay or not because your supplier is not reaching out and talking to you. That's a huge problem. I mean, we talk to buyers, and sometimes we find that they pay for orders and they just don't even show up. And then here they are 30, 40 days later, and it's a complete mess. They don't have their product. They've got production delays. Their staff is idle. And then they find that, oh yeah, sorry, we had to give your allocation to somebody else. But they don't reach out and tell you that. They make you hunt them down and figure out the problem. That poses huge issues with your business operation. So what that ultimately leads to is opportunity and reputation loss. So if your production is delayed and your staff is idle, you're going to have a whole lot of people mad at you. And those are your current staff and your current customers. But now what happens as a result of that? Well, they didn't have a great experience, and they're going to talk about that experience. So you're going to lose out on opportunities because your reputation was damaged as a result of your supply chain not being tight. And there's a level with communication that can obviously alleviate some of this stuff, but it all comes back to the conversation with your supply chain. And do they go above and beyond to communicate what's happening, and are they there to help you resolve problems, or do they kind of treat it like the problem is yours and yours only, right? These are all things that impact your business, and a supplier that doesn't help you grow, you're just a customer. They're just selling to you, and they're not working with you. And that is a problem in itself. So diving into common obstacles in the chemical space, and I've kind of talked on this with the hazmat storage and freight and logistics. I mean, it's huge, right? So for example, ethanol extraction. In the United States, there is a substantial tax imposed on pure ethanol. And, if you come from a major ethanol plant, you're talking, upwards of $27 a gallon just in tax to use pure ethanol. If you're pulling from a smaller distillery, and sometimes the larger ethanol plants are set up to have a reduced tax rate, and usually it's the first 100,000 gallons of pure ethanol that are sold per year, do have a reduced tax rate, in the $5 range. So what happens is processors have to figure out, obviously, what the rules and legalities are within your specific state. Some states do not allow you to utilize, say, heptane or hexane, for example, and you have to use pure ethanol. Well, who you pull that pure ethanol from is it's gonna make a big impact on what you end up paying for it. So the loophole with that is a category of ethanol called completely denatured alcohol, CDA. And the specific class that is highly, highly used in the hemp industry specifically is CDA 12A. And what that is 200 proof ethanol, and that's denatured with high purity N-heptane. And the definition of a denaturant essentially means it makes the product undrinkable. It is non-consumable. And to make it completely denatured, you have to prove that once you make that blend, you're not going to be able to separate that blend without essentially boiling it. So the completely denatured rules are interesting because there is no federal excise tax. And yes, there are sales taxes, but sales taxes are also alleviated by having tax-exempt certificates, resale licenses. There's ways to go around that aspect. So what we find is in the cannabis space, it is reliant on gas hydrocarbons and pure ethanol, which pure ethanol becomes to not be cost effective because of that tax. Now in the hemp world, overwhelmingly, the number one product is the CDA 12A, the ethanol denatured with N-heptane. And I'll tell you what, the industry would much rather use pure ethanol, but it is not cost effective, especially when you're talking about, for example, when I got into the industry, a kilogram of CBD isolate was $11,000. And now it's hovering between, $275 and $400 per kilogram. So when you're looking at your costs of chemicals and how that impacts your end price, you're not even going to be able to play ball in the hemp world if you're paying for that tax. I mean, it pretty much prices you out. And the only scenario that I see that doesn't price you out is if you're certified USDA organic, which requires pure USDA certified organic ethanol. And that's, obviously in itself, it's got its own advertising benefit, and consumers are looking for that stamp. But outside of that, I mean, you're going to be priced out as a processor by using pure ethanol. And that's just the unfortunate fact of the way that our politics are kind of set up. So, the other obstacles are hazmat storage limitations. In addition to the storage limitations, certain states not allowing certain chemicals to be used in these processes at all in general. What we find on the hazmat storage limitations, what happens there is usually it's a problem with ethanol, and usually it's a result of insurance, the fire marshal, and the facility just not being up to spec to be able to hold enough, or even the zoning. So where is your building located? Who's next door to you? All of these things are going to be taken into account to determine how much flammable material you can have on site. And that's one of the bigger things that affects small processors is your storage limitations, because now, you'll often find lapses in supply because you can't hold over a certain amount on site. So now you're forced to order once a week, and if you're smaller, it's going to be on LTL. It's not going to be a dedicated truck, and 1 week might be late, 1 week might be early, and if it comes early and you've got too much hazmat material on site, if it comes late, now your production is idle. That's a really tough one to overcome, and there needs to be a lot of collaboration with your local jurisdiction and your fire marshal to work through that. And again, it might result in your whole business operation isn't feasible because of where you're located, or because of the way that your fire marshal is treating you, or because the rules in your specific county. So these are things that you want to look into before you even really get set up, because you could go out of business just because you literally can't and are not allowed to hold enough ethanol on site to have a viable production facility. And then again, number 3, freight and logistics. Again, it's a huge obstacle because there's nothing guaranteed anymore. Before COVID, these shipments had guarantees, and you could pay a little bit extra to make sure that your product is going to get there on time. All of the carriers, especially the LTL side, they don't have guarantees anymore. There are no guarantees. They can't guarantee because the market is too chaotic. So, having foresight and having the understanding of what is your usage, and obviously it's a tough one because, say you're a toll processor, for example, and you get a great tolling deal and someone pulls up to your facility with a bunch of biomass and now you're ready to run it. Well, you've got to get your chemicals there. And if that is a random order that you didn't predict, well, you don't have chemicals on site, most likely, especially, again, if you're on the smaller side. So these are all things, you just have to look at the books, and you just have to look, once you're up and running for a couple months, what are your efficiencies? How much can you store? Is there a way to collaborate with the fire marshal to get additional storage? Are there things that you can build out within your facility to make it safer? In the cannabis side, a lot of these hydrocarbons and these extremely flammable products require a class 1 div 1 building. And those aren't super easy to get, and it's expensive, So these are all things that as you get up and running, or if you're already running, I'm sure you're experiencing some of this stuff. But education and foresight and knowing that these things could be a potential problem could be a make or break for your business. I'm going to dive into world events and how this affected chemical supply. So, this is all a result of COVID. There were issues with some of this stuff, periodically before COVID. But I'm just kind of going to go in, chronological order. So essentially, right when COVID hit, what happened was you saw a massive boom in sanitizer and disinfectants. So much to the point where USP grade, and that's United States Pharmacopoeia grade, pharmaceutical grade product that has really, really strict guidelines on impurities. All of that product was gone. It all immediately, pretty much overnight, went into sanitizer. So much to the point where the FDA changed the rules so you could use food grade ethanol in your sanitizer. And that resulted in a bunch of poor quality product on the sanitizer market. But what really ended up happening was the cannabis and hemp industries were underserved, because the quality ethanol that we need, the pharmaceutical grade ethanol that we need, was almost exclusively sold into hand sanitizer and disinfectants. So, moving beyond that, what we saw was ethanol prices, generally sit, $3.50 to $4, sometimes a little bit lower depending on the quality and what you're exactly buying. I mean, I was seeing a gallon of hand sanitizer ethanol selling for $9, $10, $11 plus freight. And that's absurd. And obviously the ethanol manufacturers, the ethanol plants, they chose to sell to the to the highest bidder and to who needed it the most. Well, sanitizing and disinfecting needed it the most, and our industry got overlooked there for a couple months. What ended up happening beyond that to the corn market, a rule changed, a policy changed, and this was, probably 6 months ago, that allowed our United States farmers of corn to essentially make more money on exporting the product than if they would keep it in their normal, lead sales downline. So a lot of the corn was sold and it was exported. And so there was a lapse, and we're still in that lapse right now, where the cost per bushel of corn was through the roof because all the farmers were incentivized to get the product out of the country and get a quick dollar in than it was to keep it here and to sell it into the market. So that caused a big hiccup as well. Harvest for corn is happening now in the southern states, and it'll be happening in a week, 2 weeks in the Corn Belt, the higher areas of the Corn Belt. So there's going to be some stability in ethanol prices coming here. Moving on to vaccine production. So this one's an interesting one that specifically affects the hemp industry. So N-heptane is, like I said earlier, is the denaturant used in the tax-free ethanol. And that is a pharmaceutical ingredient. And what happened was, when the vaccine was ready to hit the market, there's a high level of N-heptane that is needed in the production process. And I'm not saying that there's N-heptane inside the vaccine, but it is a crucial part of developing and maintaining the vaccine. So what you saw was big players like Chevron Phillips, who were the domestic suppliers of N-heptane, immediately overnight, their entire capacity was gone. It was all allocated to the government. So what does that do to the N-heptane market? Well, the people who had stock available, you couldn't get more unless you imported it. So what did they do? They all raised their prices. And you saw N-heptane prices go from, 65, 70 cents a pound, up to $3 a pound, $3.50 a pound. And, that's stabilizing, but the vaccine production's not going anywhere. It's not going to slow down. And domestic supply is extremely choked. And the only way you can get it is if you're a distributor who does tens of millions of dollars with these manufacturers. I mean, everybody's priced out with domestic supply right now. So what that results in is companies like Simple Solvents importing. And luckily, we caught the wind of the allocation shifting early on, and we were able to make a move, because otherwise CDA 12A would be, again, overpriced. It already is a little bit high due to the corn market and obviously the inflated prices of heptane. But if certain companies didn't pivot to import, none of that material would have made it into the hemp world. So, that caused a big wrench in the supply chain of heptane, and obviously the supply chain of the denatured ethanol, and that's just now starting to stabilize. And again, back to freight and import backups. So not only are there backups coming into ports, there's backups shipping the product from the port to the plants and to the distributors. There's backups even getting onto a boat. One of the interesting facts is, pulling out a container from China. I mean, that, ranges like $2,500 to $3,000. And we're seeing estimates coming out at like $18,000 now. I mean, it is super, super high, but ignore the price for a second, because the lead time to even get onto a boat is extremely long. And then once it's on a boat, it's got to get over here. And then once it's here, it's got to sit at the port for probably a month, maybe even more. And then once it's through the port, you've got to find a truck. So the world events really threw every supply chain in the world is going through struggles right now. But the chemical supply chain is just an interesting one because of the globalization and where all the product is manufactured. Kind of one of the later points here. So full truckload and tanker. We kind of talked about this. The full truckloads are probably, out of everything, the easier aspect to find and book. They are a little bit too expensive, but you can get them. Now, tankers, for example, the tankers are very hard to find, and they're very overpriced. So much to the point where the loading up totes with a fixed cost of an actual tote, filling that up with the ethanol and shipping it on a full truck that's not a tanker sometimes comes out to be cheaper than shipping it in bulk with no packaging, on a big 7,000 gallon tanker truck. So the tanker industry is struggling right now. In addition, I didn't put it on here, but rail is in the same scenario as the tanker world. Getting stuff on a train and moving that, it's expensive. There's a substantial lead time. It's hard to find bookings without long-term commitments and large volumes. LTL shipments, like I said, it's a mess. They're late picking the product up. Sometimes it gets put into a distribution hub and shoved in the corner, and it doesn't get found until you call and hound the guys and say, hey, where's my load? Oh, it's been sitting in this warehouse. Well, get it on a truck, get it out. And like I said, these lead times could be 4 days, 5 days, or they could be 15, maybe even more. So importing and exporting, we just keep, hitting it, right? It's huge. It's a huge thing that impacts every aspect of moving these chemicals around. So a little bit about us. We are Simple Solvents, and our focus is providing liquid solvents. So our number one product and our main focus is really servicing the hemp industry. We obviously have a lot of overlap in the cannabis space, but the rules are a little bit different. We focus on CDA 12A, which is pharmaceutical grade ethanol with high purity and heptane. In addition to that, we've obviously got pure ethanol with the tax associated with that. We have got isopropyl alcohol, heptane, pentane, and hexane. And, our focus, like I said, it's liquid solvents and really catering to the hemp community in their needs. Some of these other hydrocarbons like the heptane, pentane, hexane, they're utilized for, sometimes just the straight up extraction, but most often they're used for getting to isolate CBD. So, as these chemical markets fluctuate, it really makes it hard for the isolate market to stabilize. What we really pride ourselves is education, knowledge, advisory, and making sure that anybody who engages with us, even if you're not a customer, I hope that you learn something and you can apply that to make your business more successful. But at the end of the day, we are very prideful about our communication, obviously our supply chain, our partners, and our team. We're a great team. We work very well together. We've scaled substantially, especially throughout COVID. And I think that is a direct result of just being transparent, doing the research, understanding the world market, the chemical market, and over communicating when and if problems do arise. So I can open this up now to some Q&A. I'm going to close out of this tab, so I don't know what's going to happen to the screen share. But all right, that wraps up my presentation, but I'm going to dive into the Q&A here. Does anybody have any questions? Let's see here. I don't think so. It doesn't seem like there are any questions. I can kind of wait here for another 30 seconds or a minute before I go backstage. If anything pops up, give you guys some time to type. Awesome. Well, hopefully you were able to hear everything and it was articulate and clear and helpful. And like I said, if there are any questions, feel free to ask now, or you can contact me personally. I will throw my email address here, and I'm not sure if you guys are provided that, but I will make sure that I'm easy to get a hold of. And if there's any questions that do pop up, feel free to reach out. And I appreciate your time. Thanks for spending the afternoon with me. Have a good one, everybody.